Let's see how to use this repository by saving a new transaction to the database. The first thing we need is to go to the models and make sure the transaction implements base database item. So, like I mentioned before, base database item with an ID property that is primary key to the table, and this will be auto incremented property. Next, we need to register the generic repository. So here is an example of how to register a repository. We need to resolve the repository class, and here instead of user I will type transaction resolve that, and we are good to go. Let's go to the add transaction view model, private I repository for transaction. We will call this just repository. And we need this dependency. So our repository of transaction repository, and let's assign this to the local variable. We save new transaction after we click on the add button, and this triggers the add transaction command. This in turn calls the add transaction method. So our save logic will be placed here. The first thing we need to make sure is that the selected coin is different than null. That meaning that we have selected the coin. If we haven't, we need to show to the user a message that he needs to select a coin. For that, I will use the dialog message class. So to the common, add new folder for dialog functionality, and like all other things, we can go to the snippets provided in the resources section, find the dialog message implementation, and just copy this into a new class. So right click, add new class, which we'll call dialog message. Simply paste this and resolve the missing parts. Go to the add transaction, and we also need to inject the dialog message dependency. So again, we need I dialog message class and call this dialog message. Use the dependency injection in order to provide I dialog message through the out of ACK. So I dialog message, and initialize the local field for dialog message. And now we can use the dialog message. So dialog message has different actions. It can provide display sheet, it can display just common alert, and it can display a prompt for user to enter some text. In this case, we will use the display alert, and if the selected coin is 0, we will state error, please select a coin, and the button on the alert will be OK. This is an async method, so we need to await it. Okay, moving on to the saving to the database. what I will do is to set isBusy of the view model to true, and I need to set it to false once we are done with the logic. And here I can create new transaction which we will store in the database. So new transaction, just need to fill out the properties. We have the amount, this comes from the amount field. Next we have the transaction date, this comes from the date picker in the view. Symbol comes from the selected coin dot symbol. Status, so transaction can be of type deposit or withdrawn, and if our isDeposit property is equal to true, then the status will get from constants dot transaction deposited. Otherwise we have constants dot transaction withdrawn status, and we can just use the repository here to save async the new transaction we have just created. And that's the whole gist of how to save a new transaction to the database. So repository takes this transaction and saves that to the database. We don't have to perform any additional queries. And once we are done with the saving, we want to navigate back to the transactions view. So we need to use the navigation service. Let's also add the navigation service. And also inject the navigation service through the constructor. So here we can use navigation service dot pop async, and this will navigate to the previous view. Last thing I can do here is to perform extract method on this part of code and extract that into a separate method, just to have the whole odd transaction method a bit cleaner. So left click on the bulb, extract method, and we will call this method save new transaction. The reason we are using isBusy here and we set it to true and false is that we want to disable the execution of the add transaction command if we are adding a new transaction to the database. So we want to prevent from inserting the same transaction 2 times. The command can also take one additional parameter, and this is whether or not we can execute this command, and we will use the isNotBusy property of the view model. This is just our reverse of isBusy. Before we preview changes, let's just add the return here. So we don't want to resume with processing and saving new transactions and if we don't have the selected coin. So now let's see how this looks like. Another thing I have noticed is that we are missing the exclamation mark here. So now let's preview the changes. Okay, transactions. Let's add a new one. If we go to the add and we haven't entered the amount, we will get the error. If we go to the add, now we will get the error that we need to select a coin. Okay, if we select a coin and select a transaction date, so the transaction date is currently minimum transaction date. Let's just quickly fix that by adding the default for the transaction date. Transaction date by default is going to be datetime now. And also the initial value of the isDeposit is going to be true. Now let's see how to save a new transaction. Add new one, Bitcoin, amount 1, today's date, and if we click on the add, the transaction has been saved to the database, but here we are still using the hard-coded data, and let's see how to change this to load the actual transaction saved in the database.